let's get an update on Syria, Vanessa.
Yeah, so just a very quick overview of what's happening after I reported last week, the kind of revolution Mark II in the south. So last Sunday, members of US Congress visited northern Syria. 3 Republican congressmen. Moving forward, we can just see who they are. So on the left, French Hill, in the middle, Scott Fitzgerald, former military, and Ben Klein. So let's see who these guys are and what they were doing there. Interesting, French Hill was the organizer of the trip, who accused Biden of not doing enough to pressure Assad to adopt political reforms. Political reforms, of course, essentially means regime change. And extraordinarily, what he said, this was buried at the end of the, I think it was an ABC article. What I believe Syria needs, and the same thing the US needs, is American leadership. Extraordinary. Syria has its own leadership, and yet it's supposed to accept American leadership by proxy, obviously. Then we go on just to have a quick look at who Republican French Hill is. So this is back in 2019. Our obligation to end Assad's reign of terror is something that all Americans must confront moving forward. He was instrumental in bringing in the French Hills bill to disrupt and dismantle Assad's narcotics production and trafficking. Passes through the House. You will remember the BBC Captagon documentary that was rushed through to support UK sanctions along the same lines. And here you have McCall, Wilson, Gonzalez, Hill, Boyle introduced bipartisan bill to hold Assad regime accountable. And this was relating basically to the Assad Anti-Normalization Act to prevent countries from normalizing with President Assad and with Syria very recently. So if we move on, this was his statement after his illegal visit to Syria. Arkansas Congressman French Hill statement on his visit. So what does he have to say after his visit? Over the past 7 years, I've worked tirelessly as a voice in Congress for the innocent people of Syria who are being brutally murdered by Bashar al-Assad's regime. Very familiar. We're back on the 2011 narratives again, as I mentioned last week. He mentions that the Syrian Emergency Task Force, an organization that was established at the beginning of the regime change war, based in Washington, and basically part of the anti-Syrian government complex based in America, which has been, according to him, a strong advocate in leading humanitarian efforts in the region. He mentions then that alongside Ben Klein, Scott Fitzgerald, he had the pleasure of visiting the beautiful children of SETF-sponsored school for orphans. Of course, this always rings alarm bells for me, particularly when they also met with the White Helmets, who are accused of child abduction and organ trafficking by Syrian civilians. Then let's have a quick look. I just had a very quick look at the Syrian Emergency Task Force page to see who their partners are. And I picked up on this, the Syria-Ukraine Network, or SUN, that on their Twitter page announces that they are a coalition of Syrian and Ukrainian organizations and individuals in Syria and Ukraine aiming to stop and expose Russian war crimes in Syria and Ukraine. So we see this crossover again between Syria and Ukraine becoming much more prevalent now, also in the most recent banners that the so-called demonstrators are using in the south. So this is the area that they crossed through, the red circle encircled and above Gaziantep, which was once known as the Jihadi Express, where the majority of the terrorists came through before they crossed into Turkey, and known to be the British intelligence center also, or CIA and MI6 in Turkey, related to Syria. So they crossed at the Bab al-Salame crossing. But let's see who is controlling that crossing. The Hamza Division and the Suleiman Shah Brigade, which were sanctioned very recently by the US, two terrorist militias over serious human rights abuses in Syria. including torture and abduction of civilians, including children. So extraordinary. These congressmen passed through a terrorist crossing controlled by US sanctioned terrorist groups, and yet there, of course, there are no repercussions. So I'm moving quickly to Sweden, which is the area I talked about last week, where the demonstrations have been ongoing. Although, of course, the numbers are tiny. It's a tiny minority that is being power multiplied by the United States. And I just wanted to show a couple of the protest banners that were being displayed. So the first one, people might recognize the raised fist of Otpor, the organization established in 1998 to support the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, funded and created by the CIA, George Soros, etc. And of course, perfect English detainees first reveal the destiny of the forcibly disappeared. Quite a few Syrians actually said to me, even if we speak fluent English, we're not going to write like that. And then you have the introduction again in English, UN Resolution 2254, which is effectively regime change. Moving on, I just want to very quickly talk about the northeast, going sort of around the clock in Syria, in where I've circled there in the northeast with Al-Hasaka at the center. Coming down, you see the crossing of Al-Bukamal between Syria and Iraq, which is the main road link from Iran through Iraq and into Syria, bringing essential humanitarian aid. And then down to Al-Tanif, where you have the biggest US illegal military base. And then down, I've marked again, Sweden, just so that you can get some context for the places that I'm talking about. And there, just above Aleppo, is the area where the congressman entered Syria illegally last Sunday in the company of terrorist groups. And if we look at what's happening in Al-Hasaka in the northeast, so we know that the US is trying to take control of the last open border crossing that's under the control of Iraq and Syria. I recommend everybody follows this blog for fairly intermittent but very detailed reports on the military situation on the ground in Syria. And here he's talking about a tribal uprising against the STF, which are the Kurdish Contras and separatists under the control of the US in the northeast, in Eastern Euphrates amidst US silence. What is basically happening is that the tribal factions are rising up against Kurdish occupation of Arab land in the northeast. Of course, that uprising to a degree has been orchestrated by the allies of Syria to try and occupy the US forces in the northeast, which it is doing actually very successfully. So now there are major clashes with more than 100 dead between US proxies in the northeast.
So, Vanessa, one thing I wanted to ask you was, this connection between Syria and Ukraine, is this giving us, is the current sort of escalation in Syria more about Russia than Syria?
Actually, it's interesting because a lot of the banners, a lot of the media reports are focusing on getting Russia out of Syria. So it does seem to be a sort of a line going through all of the propaganda that is leading the movement in the south. Is Russia, Nazi Russia, criminal Russia, Russian war crimes. So it does seem to be, to a degree, continuing the Ukraine campaign inside Syria.
And of course, if they can get rid of Russia out of Syria, then I presume the regime change operation becomes all the easier.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to happen. But yes, obviously, that might be high on their wish list.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
I'll just pick up on Vanessa's point about the American officials moving through areas without any problems. But if we remember back to the early days, we had Brooks Newmark MP, who was busy meeting some what we describe as very dubious characters on the border with Turkey. When we asked questions, we never got any proper replies, and our local MP refused to follow through on those questions. So totally agree with you. We've got political figures travelling to these areas. What their true role is, I don't think we can ever find out.
Okay.